It had been almost a year since we moved into the house on Maplewood Drive. At the time, it seemed like a dream come true. Affordable, spacious, with an enormous backyard perfect for the kids. My wife, Sarah, loved the vintage charm, and I was just glad to finally have enough space for my home office. We thought we had found the perfect place to settle down, but it was never really quiet. In the beginning, we chalked it up to the usual sounds of an old house. The creaking floorboards, the way the walls seemed to groan when the wind blew. I'd hear a soft thud late at night, and Sarah would tease me about my overactive imagination. "It's just the house settling," she'd say with a laugh, dismissing it as nothing. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. That was before the giggles started. At first, they were faint, so faint I wasn't sure I had even heard them. A distant sound, like the faintest echo of children laughing. But there was something about it that set me on edge. It was always late at night, well after the kids were asleep. I'd be up working, the house otherwise quiet, when I'd hear it, soft, playful giggles coming from somewhere far off. I remember the first time I heard them clearly. It was after midnight, and I was in the kitchen grabbing a drink before heading to bed. Sarah had already turned in for the night, and the kids were sound asleep in their rooms upstairs. I had just shut the fridge door when it came again, unmistakable this time, the sound of children giggling. I froze, listening. It was faint, as if it were coming from outside, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Our backyard was fenced in, and there weren't any kids nearby who would be out playing at this hour. I checked the back door, making sure it was locked, and then headed upstairs, brushing it off as my mind playing tricks on me. But the giggles didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, I began hearing them more frequently. Always late at night, always when the house was quiet. It became harder to dismiss them as coincidence, especially when I started noticing other things. Small things. Sarah would find toys out of place, toys we hadn't seen the kids play with in months. A ball that had been put away in the closet would suddenly be in the middle of the hallway. At first, we blamed the kids. Maybe they were sneaking out of bed after we'd gone to sleep, playing and then trying to put everything back before morning. But when we asked them, they both swore they hadn't touched the toys. Then came the nights when I started hearing footsteps. Light, almost imperceptible footsteps, like the soft padding of bare feet on hardwood floors. I'd hear them outside our bedroom door, in the hallway, and even in the living room downstairs. I'd get up, check on the kids, and find them sound asleep in their beds. I told myself it was just the house, or maybe the wind, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. The giggles kept getting louder, more distinct. Sometimes they sounded as if they were right outside our window, other times like they were coming from inside the house itself. I started staying up later, determined to catch whatever was causing the noise, but I never saw anything, just those strange, disembodied sounds. Sarah didn't hear them at first. Whenever I brought it up, she brushed it off, insisting it was just the wind or the neighborhood kids playing outside. But one night, everything changed. It was a Tuesday. I remember that because I had stayed up late working on a project for work, and Sarah had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. Around 1 a.m., just as I was finishing up, I heard the giggles again. Only this time, they were louder than ever before. I stood up, my heart pounding, and crept out of the office toward the stairs. That's when I saw her, Sarah, standing at the top of the stairs, staring down at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded slowly. I hadn't told her how bad it had gotten, hadn't wanted to scare her, but now she was hearing it too. We stood there in silence for what felt like hours, listening as the giggles echoed faintly through the house. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, bouncing off the walls like ghostly echoes of children long gone. "Where are they coming from?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the giggles were getting closer. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in our room, listening as the sounds grew louder and more frequent. By morning, we were both exhausted, but the giggles had stopped. For the first time, Sarah seemed to believe me when I said something wasn't right. That night marked the beginning of something darker. The giggles became a nightly occurrence, and it wasn't long before they escalated into something far worse. But I wasn't ready to face that yet. Not then. For now, it was just the giggles, the footsteps, and the unsettling feeling that something or someone was watching us from the shadows. Something we couldn't see but could feel all around us. The house had never felt so small, so claustrophobic. I started dreading the silence after midnight, because that's when they always came. That's when the giggles began. After that night, Sarah and I tried to find logical explanations for what was happening. Maybe the house really was just old, we told ourselves. Maybe the kids' toys were getting knocked over by drafts or settling vibrations from the nearby train. But deep down, neither of us truly believed it anymore. Still, we kept up the charade, acting like everything was fine during the day. Sarah would take the kids to school, I'd work from home, and we would go through the motions of our routines, trying to push the events of the night out of our minds. But as soon as the sun went down, that uneasy feeling returned. Every creak, every distant noise set us on edge, as if we were waiting for something to happen. One night, about a week after Sarah first heard the giggles, I decided to stay up again. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I couldn't stand feeling helpless anymore. If there was something in the house, something causing the noises, I was going to find it. It was just after midnight when I heard the first sound, the familiar, distant giggle, faint but unmistakable. I stood up from my desk and quietly made my way downstairs, careful not to wake Sarah. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the walls. I reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, listening. The giggles had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. For a moment, I considered turning back, but something compelled me to keep going. I walked through the living room, toward the kitchen, checking the locks on the back door out of habit. Everything was secure. As I turned to head back upstairs, I heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible noise, like the rustle of fabric or the whisper of movement. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the hallway, just outside the kids' rooms. I slowly crept toward the stairs, my eyes fixed on the dark hallway at the top. I could barely make out the outline of the doors, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something, just a flicker of movement, like a shadow darting out of sight. I blinked, and it was gone. But the giggles started again. This time, they were louder, clearer, and unmistakably coming from upstairs. My stomach twisted with dread as I slowly made my way up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The closer I got to the top, the louder the giggles became, until they were echoing through the hallway, bouncing off the walls. I reached the landing and turned toward the kids' rooms, my heart in my throat. Both doors were closed, just as we had left them when we tucked the kids in. But the giggles, they were right there, as if coming from just beyond the doors. I opened the door to Jake's room first. He was fast asleep, sprawled out across his bed like usual, his breathing deep and steady. Nothing seemed out of place, but the giggles hadn't stopped. They sounded even closer now, as if they were right next to me. I quickly crossed the hallway to check on Emma. Her room was dark, the soft glow of her nightlight casting long shadows across her bed. She, too, was sound asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit close to her chest. I stood there for a moment, watching her breathe, my heart slowly beginning to calm. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just outside the reach of the nightlight's glow, something moved. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the curtains swaying in the breeze. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was a figure, small, childlike, crouched in the corner, its back to me. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see the outline of what looked like a small child, sitting perfectly still, facing the wall. My blood ran cold. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I stood there, frozen, my heart racing in my chest. The room was empty. Emma was still asleep, undisturbed by whatever had just happened. But I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining it. Something or someone had been there watching her. I backed out of the room slowly, closing the door as quietly as I could. The giggles had stopped, replaced once again by an unsettling silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I told Sarah about what I had seen. I half expected her to dismiss it, to say it was just a shadow, or that I was overtired. But she didn't. Instead, she just looked at me with wide, frightened eyes and said, "I saw it too." I stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. "When? Last night," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I woke up in the middle of the night, and I saw something standing in the hallway. It was small like a child, but it was wrong. It didn't move, it just stood there, staring at me. And then it was gone." We sat in silence for a long time after that, neither of us knowing what to say. The reality of what was happening was sinking in, and neither of us could pretend anymore. Something was in our house, something that wasn't supposed to be there. That night we kept the lights on. It didn't help. The giggles came again, louder this time, and more frequent. The shadows that once seemed like tricks of the light were now unmistakable figures, darting just out of sight. We both saw them, small, childlike shapes that flickered in and out of view, always just at the edge of our vision, and always accompanied by those maddening, echoing giggles. The worst part wasn't the sounds or even the shadows. It was the feeling that came with them, the overwhelming sense of being watched, of something standing just behind us, just out of reach. Every night it got worse. Every night the figures seemed to come closer, until the night one of them appeared at the foot of our bed. We didn't sleep after that. We couldn't. The night the figure appeared at the foot of our bed, everything changed. We had been lying there in the dark, both too scared to sleep, listening to the creaks and groans of the house. The giggles hadn't started yet, but the air was thick with tension, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I had been staring at the ceiling, trying to focus on the faint hum of the air conditioner, when Sarah suddenly gripped my arm. Her nails dug into my skin, and when I turned to look at her, her eyes were wide with terror, her face pale. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I froze. My eyes darted to the foot of the bed, following her gaze, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood there, bathed in the dim glow of the night light from the hallway. It was small, no taller than a child, its silhouette blurry and indistinct, like it was being filtered through fog. But there was no mistaking what it was. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing at the foot of the bed. It was like every nightmare I'd ever had come to life, manifesting in this dark, twisted form that defied explanation. I didn't dare breathe. For what felt like an eternity, we lay there, too scared to move, too scared to speak. The figure remained completely still, but I could feel its presence pressing down on us, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving us gasping for breath in the oppressive silence. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment it was there, solid and real, and the next it was as if it had never been there at all. The space at the foot of the bed was empty, the night returning to its eerie quiet. Neither of us said anything. We couldn't. We just lay there, trembling, our minds struggling to make sense of what had just happened. When morning finally came, we didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. The terror of the previous night still hung heavy in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. Sarah went about her morning routine in a daze, barely acknowledging the kids as they got ready for school. Couldn't blame her. I felt the same, like I was walking through a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. That night, we didn't even try to sleep in our bedroom. Instead, we brought the kids into the living room and camped out on the floor, surrounded by the soft glow of every light we could turn on. The kids thought it was fun. A little indoor adventure, they called it, but Sarah and I knew better. We weren't having a sleepover. We were hiding. The lights stayed on, every door locked, every window checked twice. But it didn't matter. The giggles returned, echoing through the house like a twisted lullaby, growing louder as the night wore on. The shadows crept closer, flitting across the walls, darting in and out of the corners of my vision. Sarah sat beside me, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes fixed on the hallway. I could tell she was trying to keep calm for the kids, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. We both knew something was coming. We just didn't know when. Around 3 a.m., the giggles stopped. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had been tormenting us had finally left. But then I saw Sarah's face go pale, her body stiffening beside me. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. I turned to look at my son, who had fallen asleep beside his sister on the living room floor. First, everything seemed normal. His chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of sleep, his small body curled up in his blanket. But then I saw it. His eyes were open. Jake was lying there, perfectly still, staring up at the ceiling, his eyes wide and glassy. His expression was blank, completely devoid of emotion, like he wasn't even there. "Jake?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond. He didn't move. He just kept staring, unblinking, as if he were trapped in some kind of trance. I reached out to touch him, my hand trembling as it hovered over his shoulder. But before I could make contact, he spoke. "They're coming," he said, his voice flat and distant, like he was speaking from somewhere far away. "They're here." A chill ran down my spine, my hand recoiling as if I had been burned. Sarah let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. I turned to her, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Jake had never spoken like that before. So cold, so detached. It was like he wasn't even our son anymore. I turned back to Jake, But before I could say anything else, his eyes slowly closed, and he fell back into what looked like normal sleep, his body relaxing as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We just sat there, watching the shadows dance along the walls, waiting for whatever was coming next. The next morning, Jake didn't remember a thing. He acted completely normal, like the events of the previous night hadn't even happened. When I asked him about what he had said, about the giggles, the shadows, anything, he just looked at me like I was crazy. "Dad, I was asleep," he said with a shrug, going back to his breakfast. Sarah and I exchanged worried glances. Something was wrong. We didn't know what, but we knew it was getting worse. The figures, the giggles, the shadows, they were no longer just fleeting moments of terror. They were getting bolder. They were making themselves known. And now they had Jake. We tried to go about our day as normally as possible, but the tension was unbearable. Every creak of the house, every small noise set us on edge. I found myself constantly checking on the kids, watching them for any sign that something was wrong. But they seemed fine, completely oblivious to the horrors we were facing each night. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Sarah and I sat down to talk. We couldn't go on like this. Something had to be done. But neither of us knew what. "I think we need help," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't do this alone." I nodded. I had been thinking the same thing. But who could we possibly turn to for help? How could we explain what was happening without sounding insane? And even if we did find someone to believe us, would it even make a difference? Whatever was in our house, whatever had been tormenting us for weeks, wasn't something we could fight. It wasn't something we could reason with. It was something far beyond our understanding. And it was getting stronger. That night, as we lay on the living room floor with the lights on, I realized something horrifying. They weren't just coming. They were already here. By the time we finally decided to leave, it was too late. The house had already sunk its claws into us, wrapping us in its eerie embrace, and no matter how far we ran, I knew deep down that we would never truly escape. But we had to try. For the kids. For our sanity. Sarah was the first to break. She couldn't take the giggles anymore. The constant feeling of being watched. The shadows creeping closer and closer each night. I could see it in her eyes. She was unraveling, losing pieces of herself to the terror that had taken over our home. I wasn't far behind. One night, after another round of giggles and whispered threats that seemed to come from the very walls, she sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling, and said, "We need to get out of here. I don't care where we go, but we can't stay here anymore." I agreed. I would have done anything to protect my family, to save them from whatever had latched onto our lives. We packed that night, hastily throwing clothes into suitcases and grabbing only the essentials. The kids didn't understand why we were leaving. Jake and Emma begged to stay, insisting that they liked the house, that nothing was wrong. But we knew better. We loaded the car in the middle of the night, desperate to leave before the giggles could start again. The sky was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The wind had picked up, rattling the trees and howling through the cracks in the house. It felt like the house was watching us, waiting for the right moment to stop us from leaving. As I strapped Jake into his seat, he turned to me with those same glassy eyes he'd had the night before and whispered, "They won't let us go, Dad. They're everywhere." I shuddered, my hand freezing for a moment on the seatbelt buckle. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we could outrun this, that everything would be okay once we got away from the house. But I couldn't. Not when I didn't believe it myself. The drive was quiet. Too quiet. The kids fell asleep almost immediately, their small bodies curled up in the back seat, but Sarah and I stayed awake, our eyes glued to the road ahead. Every time the headlights illuminated the stretch of highway in front of us, I half expected to see something standing in the middle of the road, some figure that had followed us from the house. But the road stayed empty. We drove for hours, far enough that the house should have been a distant memory. But it wasn't. Around 4 a.m., Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you feel it too?" I knew exactly what she meant. The sense of dread hadn't left. It was still there, hanging over us like a thick fog, pressing down on my chest until it was hard to breathe. "They're still with us," I said quietly, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. She nodded, her eyes red and swollen from lack of sleep. "We'll never be free of them, will we?" I didn't have an answer. The truth was too painful to admit, even to myself. We stopped at a cheap motel on the outskirts of a small town, hoping that putting more distance between us and the house would help. We were exhausted, running on fumes, and we needed a place to rest. I paid for a room in cash, not wanting to leave a trace of where we were, as if that could somehow protect us. The kids were still asleep when we carried them into the room. I laid Jake down on one of the beds, tucking him in carefully, while Sarah did the same for Emma. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we had done the right thing, that we could finally breathe again. But the moment we turned off the lights, the giggles returned. They were faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. But they grew louder with each passing minute, echoing off the walls of the tiny motel room, filling the space with that same sickening sound we had grown to fear. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah grabbed my hand, her nails digging into my skin. "They followed us," she whispered, her voice shaking. I got up, turning on every light in the room, but it didn't help. The giggles were everywhere, surrounding us, filling our heads with that maddening sound. And then came the footsteps, the soft, slow padding of small feet on the carpet. I spun around, searching the room for the source of the noise, but there was nothing. Just the empty motel room and the suffocating sense of dread. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw them. 2 figures, small and childlike, stood in the shadows, their forms barely visible in the dim light. I could feel their eyes on me, though I couldn't see their faces. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there watching, waiting. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But I knew what they were. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Get the kids." But it was too late. As I turned to look at the bed where Jake and Emma had been sleeping, I saw that they were already sitting up, their eyes wide open, staring straight ahead. They weren't looking at us. They were looking at the figures in the corner. "They're coming," Jake said again, his voice cold and detached. And then, as if on cue, the figures moved. They stepped forward slowly at first, but with purpose. And as they did, the giggles grew louder, filling the room until it was deafening. Sarah screamed, reaching for the kids, but I knew there was no use. They weren't ours anymore. I tried to move, to run, to do something, anything, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, watching helplessly as the figures reached the edge of the bed, their dark forms blending with the shadows. Jake and Emma didn't scream. They didn't cry. They just sat there, staring at the figures with blank expressions, as if they had been expecting this all along. And then, in one final, sickening moment, they were gone. The figures, the giggles, the children. All of it disappeared, swallowed by the darkness that had plagued us for weeks. The room was silent, unbearably so. I stood there, my mind racing, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice broken, as she stumbled toward the empty bed. "Emma?" But they were gone. We left the motel that night. We left everything. Our car, our belongings, it didn't matter anymore. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that we had lost them. And no matter how far we ran, no matter how much distance we put between us and the house, we knew we would never get them back. The giggles had taken them, and we were left with nothing but silence.